I should introduce myself first. My name is Shahina Farid, and I'm very pleased to be uh, welcoming you all to this evening's British Institute at Ankara's lecture in the Archaeology series. I'm delighted to be introducing this evening's talk by bioarchaeologist Dr. Brenna Hassett, who will be talking about her research on the human remains assemblage excavated at Başur Höyük. I'm particularly grateful to you, Brenna, for your patience. As we were talking about earlier on, I'd invited you to speak to us at a live event in London, which was supposed to take place last spring. But we all know what caused the delay, and I'm sure we're all very grateful to be here now. And a particular advantage of Zoom lecture series is how we can reach a much wider audience. So welcome to you all, and please do say hello in the chat box. The format of this evening's talk is that we welcome questions that we ask you to add into the Q&A box, which I will then read out to Brenna at the end of her talk. And I'd also like to make a plea on behalf of the BIAA that your membership is most welcome, as it helps the BIAA conduct its research as well as run these live events. A few words about Brenna that you may or may not know. She is, by her own admission, more than a little obsessed with teeth. Not in the way of dentistry, in the way that most of us think about teeth, but as artifacts to study child growth, health, and diet in the past. The secrets that teeth hold about us and our past was, in fact, the subject of Brenna's PhD, which she did with Professor Simon Hilson at the Institute of Archaeology, University College London. And this led to her very successful book called Built on Bones, 15,000 Years of Urban Life and Death. Published in 2017 by Bloomsbury, it made it to the Times top 10 science book list. It tells the tale of, and I quote, shifts in human growth and health that have occurred as we transition from a mobile to a largely settled species. I think quite current to what we're going through today. The book had such a claim as this from The Guardian, an upbeat, wisecracking attempt to trace the development of cities through thousands of years of human disease, violence, and misery. Amusing footnotes interrupt serious arguments, while pop culture references jostle with sobering research. And from the Times, Built on Bones is entertaining, colloquial, and has a fine line in funny footnotes. It's not often that we find human remains the subject of humor. Brenna is also very active on social media, and another of her great successes is her being a founding member of the Trailblazers website, which celebrates women in archaeology. The backstory, I'm told, is that a group of friends who created the forum were too used to reading about archaeological discoveries being mostly made by men in the past, and nothing about the women who were also involved. So this group of friends set about updating public records, and their website hosts a growing list of names of women from all over the world who have made great contribution to archaeology, paleontology, and geology, and in far greater numbers than most people realize. And I'm sure Brenna herself would welcome any new suggestions that any of you have to offer. Well, there's a lot more to say about Brenna, but I'll stop and I'll let you get to know her through her research on the physical anthropology at the site of Başur Höyük near modern-day Siirt in the Upper Tigris region. Bodies, bronze, and Başur. what the dead have to say about it. Tell us, please, Brenna.
Wow, thank you so much, Shahina. That was that's incredibly flattering. I worked with Shahina back in the day at Başur Höyük when I was a know-nothing master's student, and Shahina was way high above me. So it is an absolute thrill to have that lovely introduction. So thank you very much. But I'm aware that you are all here for the dead people. At least I hope you are, because that's what you're going to get. So hopefully we can all see the screen here, and we'll talk about one of the most interesting archaeological sites that I think probably ever was, though I'm biased. So, Başur Höyük. Just to note that this talk does include images of human remains, and while it's my name on the cap there, this is very much a team effort, and I could not have done any of this without the director of the archaeological project, Dr. Haluk Saglimtimur, and Metin Batihan, Inan Aydoğan, Osman Osman, Emma Basel, Suzanne Pilar Birch, and Ian Barnes, Lena Brace. We have a huge team that's working on these issues. So all of the work is a team effort. All of the errors are mine as we move forward. So where am I talking about? I am talking about the site of Başur Höyük, which is located where that little star is. It's near Siirt. And if you can just about make out, there are two large rivers in this area of the world, the Euphrates and the Tigris. And we're right in the top, we're in the Upper Tigris basin. And of course, this area of the world has been very, very studied over the world, the sort of Mesopotamian period. And what I'm specifically going to talk about is Win, which is the sort of 4th and 3rd millennium BC transition. So for those of you who are not absolute experts in the subject, we're sort of up on the northern fringes of Mesopotamia, and we're looking at the period where we go between a sort of Uruk period culture, which is these lovely bevel rim bowls, to a sort of royal cemetery at Ur type culture, which is that, of course, the big human sacrifice-filled graves that Woolley excavated. So the transition between these phases is an interesting and understudied area, and research at Başur is hopefully helping us sort some of this out. So where are we? Here is the mound. It is on the Başur River, which is here, but used to be here. So it's right on one of these main tributaries down into the Tigris. And this is the mound from above. And there's actually about 7,000 years of human occupation on this mound. So there's 2nd millennium BC, there's a big Uruk culture material period. But what we're interested in today is very specifically the early Bronze Age cemetery. So that's about 3100 to 2800 calibrated BC. And that tiny little red dot off in the corner is what may or may not be also some other early Bronze Age material. But we're going to talk about the cemetery. So one of the really interesting things that happens in this transition is that people start being buried. And they start being buried in a very specific way. An entirely new culture of burial comes in right at this sort of 4th millennium, 3rd millennium transition. And there's big changes. So the number one change is that there are cist graves, which are stone slab sided graves. There's a lot of metal in these graves. Grave goods are going in. And at both Arslan Tepe at the top of the Euphrates and Başur Höyük, top of the Tigris, we see human sacrifice. And this is an entirely new phenomenon that needs explaining. So here's Başur Höyük at the top, the big retainer sacrifice grave, very similar to that found at Arslan Tepe, top of the Euphrates, very similar period, where there's a sort of main central burial with a lot of grave goods, and then auxiliary retainers placed around the grave, all done at the same time. And this is our evidence for very early human sacrifice. So the cemetery, I hope you can see my mouse as it moves across the screen. But this is an overview. So you'll see these are these cyst graves. Whoops, try that again. Cyst graves across the mound. And then here is a very large pit, which we will definitely talk about later. So just to reiterate, the excavation here is a team effort, but all misinterpretations are solely mine. I am responsible for physical anthropology, so we call ourselves team anthropology at Başur. But I was brought in to excavate human remains and to do the analysis afterwards. And that's what I do. I do the bioarchaeological assessment. So my role in this project is to look at things like age, to understand different mortality risks and social roles that might be associated, biological sex and how that might be associated with different social roles again, and of course, paleopathology, the things that put those people in the ground to begin with. So these are all standard questions to ask. And the one notable feature that I'm going to preview in terms of we have a series of innovative approaches at Başur, but one thing I'll preview is our technique for estimating sex. So as I go through, I'm going to go through the graves and talk about who's in the graves at Başur. You're going to notice that I say things like boy, 5 years old, girl, 12 years old. It's not usually possible to actually determine the biological sex of someone who hasn't gone through puberty from their skeletal remains. This is for fairly obvious reasons. Their bodies haven't gone through the changes that we normally use to assess whether a skull or a pelvis is male or female. However, humans, while not terribly different in body size, not like our friend the baboon, who is, you can see here, with the male with his big giant fang tooth and the female without, humans do have about 7% dimorphism or difference in shape between males and females in their canine teeth. So the estimates you're going to see are based on population sort of level algorithms that work out whether a tooth is likely to be male or female. So they are just estimates, but it was quite fun to be able to use teeth, which are, as Shahina mentioned, my favorite, to do a little bit of the interpretive work. So the cemetery at Başur Höyük consists of several different types of graves. And I think probably the thing that is most interesting are the cyst graves. There are two sort of types that we can see. One are these paired graves where you have an internal grave with walls and then another grave just adjacent, sort of using a shared wall. And then we do have a couple that are just unpaired, that are just standalone cysts. And we can go through, there's only a handful of graves at this cemetery. It was only used for about 300 years. But we can go through and get an idea of the types of graves, and they are kind of astonishing. So the thing about Başur Höyük is there is a lot of metal. There is just a lot of metal. There are spearheads. There are small pins as they would be worn. There are axe types. There are any number of ritual objects, these cups. There are seals. There are these beautiful sort of mace heads or finials. And essentially what you need to know is that Başur has an intense amount of what is not actually bronze, but a copper alloy, despite the increasingly inaccurately named Bronze Age. It also has beads. Here's our trailblazer doll with some of the beads collected. And I'd just like everyone to pay attention to these sort of mass-produced bichrome beads, sort of black and white beads that we find that may actually have originally been parts of fabric, and the work of Anna Basel and our student Joe Richards has been really interesting in this respect. These are really interesting bichrome panels, and we find these in very specific contexts at Başur. So moving through the graves, we have some of our unpaired cysts, just standalone. These do have multiple burials, a child and a younger adult, and then a younger adult and an older adult. And these have metal objects like seals, spearheads, ceramics, and these are fairly typical of the grave goods. And certainly there are people on this call who can tell you a little bit more, Metin, if you have questions later. Then we have two other standalone cysts, graves 11 and 12. Graves 11 and 12 aren't burials. They have no human remains in them. They do have some animal remains, but they have no human remains. They're actually cyst graves, very much in the same shape and format, but they have a slightly different material culture. They do have some metal, but they lack a lot of the beads and personal ornamentation that we would expect people to be buried with. And they also have this guy, a wing from a golden eagle, which was very unexpected, and we still don't quite have an explanation for. Then we come to the paired graves. So graves 7 and 8 are fairly simple versions. There's a single interment. One of them has some of these metal spearheads, and they have ceramics with them, including a bevel rim bowl, I believe. And then we come to the sort of second, more complicated type of paired grave. So this is the pair of grave 6 and grave 9. In the inside, in this internal walled cyst, we have a young individual, about 14 years old, possibly a boy. On the outside, however, we have several individuals. We have an adult male, a female, and 2 children. We have a very large amount of grave goods in both contexts, including ceilings, ritual objects, some of this blackface wear. We also have, in grave 9, I believe the world's earliest gaming pieces. And these 3 little fellows, there should be 4, I believe, hedgehogs. One of the cutest finds, I think, ever uncovered. And of course, it happened at Başur. The other thing there are 2 of these bichrome panels, or what might be 2. These are very rough estimates at this point, in the external grave. Then we come to graves 13 and 14. So again, in the internal walled area, we have another young male, probable male, this time with an adult, probably a female. And then outside again, we have a female, a male, and then another child, sort of slightly older girl. And as you may be able to see, there are, again, bichrome panels. So there are actually probably 3 in the external, and then there's a small, slightly differently sized one inside the wall this time. And then we come to graves 15 and 17, and this is the very large, very obvious retainer burial example of human sacrifice that was uncovered in 2014 and excavated in very fine circumstances, and sort of a miracle that they got it done, but incredible finds, really. So you can see grave 15 and 17 is this context that's just outside the walled cysts, and you can see these bodies that have been laid kind of one on top of each other, pressed right up against the foot of grave 15. So inside the walled cyst, we actually suddenly have 3 people. We have a slightly younger, we have an older adolescent or a younger adult, I think it's probably around 15, 16, in one corner. And then centrally, we have a girl, possibly, and a boy, possibly, but almost exactly the same age. And next to one of them is a bichrome panel. And the other thing that is really noticeable in this grave is the presence of spears. These metal spearheads, there are a lot of spears. There are an insane number of spears. There is so much metal spearhead going on in this grave, that they're actually still bundled. They were recovered with textiles tying them together. So they're actually still wrapped in the bundles in which they were deposited. It is something, it's certainly over 120 spearheads, and it may be more now. I don't think I have the exact count. And then we have grave 17. So you can see a little bit more clearly, hopefully, some of the bodies. So these are articulated and laid out, positioned carefully in death, in a position that's clearly at the feet of these two 12-year-old individuals. And found on the bodies, on the torsos, are, again, these bichrome panels. Not on all of them, we can't say that they're on all of them, but we certainly find an impressive amount of these bichrome beads. And outside, we have, again, young people. There are two males, the age is undetermined, but they are youngish. They are adult youngish, so probably under 25. And then we have 3 boys and 3 girls, and that's what's estimated. So a total of 8 individuals have been placed simultaneously with the main internal walled burial. So this is pretty conclusive evidence of at least a retainer burial, that people are being buried with other individuals and positioned in respect to them. The paleopathology reveals that they were in fact killed violently. So these are pictures of 2 different skulls. Unfortunately, taphonomic damage is fairly extreme, so we don't really have these skulls completely intact. But piecing them together in the lab, we were able to identify sharp force head trauma. So a sort of penetrating trauma from a fairly sharp object, a little bit like a pointed hammer, like an ice pick, but bigger. An ice hammer would be about right. And from the photos from excavation, it looks like there were probably multiple types of these wounds. So what we know is that grave 17, this outside the internal walled cyst, these people have been killed, and they've been killed with injuries that are found somewhere else, 500 kilometers south-ish, and 500 years in the future at the Royal Cemetery of Ur. So recent work by, well, I guess not that recent, but Badsgaard et al. Used CT scanning to reconstruct the skulls of some of the burials from the Royal Cemetery of Ur held at Penn. And they discovered these sharp force penetrating trauma wounds in some of the sacrifices. And that there, down in the corner here, is an Akkadian battle axe. Not the right period, but just to give you an idea of the type of weapon that could cause the injuries that are seen both at Başur and the Royal Cemetery. Then we have pits. And you may think the pits are less interesting, but that's because we haven't got to grave 16 yet. So the pit graves do not have this big cyst formation. They are even lower profile, but they are in the same area, in the same cemetery area. They all have multiple bodies, and they have different grave goods, possibly fewer, but they do have some impressive ones. So here is grave 4, which is a young adult female and was interpreted as her child, about 4 years old, so possibly a mother and child burial, and found with an immense amount of very interesting ritual metal objects. There is grave 5, which is found with almost nothing interesting, unless you like the pottery, sorry. But another adult and child burial. And then there is grave 10, which is utterly baffling. This is, as far as I know, unique. This is a pit burial in a daisy chain. There's one individual, there's another one, there's another one. In a circular formation, we have at least 6 older individuals. And there's no appreciable grave goods with these burials at all. Someone has also gone to the effort of putting them in a circle, but there's no real grave goods unless you count the sort of small personal adornments like pins that they were probably wearing. And then we come to grave 16. Grave 16 is my problem. It's why I was called out. And I am, just for reference, I am taking a photograph in this image. I am not crying, despite, yes, what you might think. Grave 16 is a mass death pit that was uncovered in 2014 by the team. And it is just an immense death pit. Here is an overview of the, once the top layer was cleaned off. And I hope you can get a sense from this image of how immensely complicated this context was. There are, all of the individuals here are fully articulated or were at one point when they were deposited, but they have settled. There's been some movement of water through the soil, which has essentially consolidated some of the soil into almost concrete-like hardness. And then, of course, water movement through the bones themselves had made them friable, prone to break, and very, very difficult to excavate. So our mission back in 2015, and originally supported by the BIAA, was to find out what happened and in no way infringe copyright with CSI Mesopotamia. One of the most notable things about this burial is that there are no grave goods. They are individuals wearing essentially, fairly nice personal adornments. There are gold beads, as Osner here is modeling. There are the pins and things that they would have been wearing. You can see actually the amount of bronze staining. Those bronze stains are actually from the pins that were in their clothing. And as water, probably what we call coffin fluid, sort of moved through, the reaction between the bronze and the bone leaves these greenish stains. So we find those quite frequently on the collarbones. So we know that these are sort of basically cloak closures or something like that. But they're accompanied by nothing beyond what they were wearing. So excavation was very interesting. It was an impressive effort by the team in trying circumstances. Here is our fearless leader, Höyük, putting up a tent to save us. I believe Metin is assisting him there. So excavation, we sort of had to be innovative. This is a rescue context. This is in advance of the Ilisu barrage, so in advance of dam construction. So this is technically rescue excavation, and we did not have a lot of time to do this. So what we ended up doing is setting up a grid over the burials and attempting to actually control where we collected using a combination of sort of total station and these grid squares, so that when we found little individual toes, little individual hands, we could actually still position them in the grave, even if we couldn't decide who they belonged to at the moment. We did put a lot of effort in. This is my research assistant, Sarah, who is holding what you probably cannot see, but it's a Stapes bone. It is an ear bone. This is the sine qua non of bioarchaeology, excavating so well that you find this, couple millimeter high ear bone means that you are in fact finding everything. And we did our best at Başur. So using these kind of spatial techniques, we created this grid, we took total station points. We're actually able to use some sort of basically GIS system, geographical information systems, to try and reconstruct some of the spatial patterning in order to understand this depositional event, what happened when these people went into the ground. So one of the questions we asked, for instance, was all of these little pieces that we find, are they in any sort of pattern? Is there any sort of pattern to how people were put in the grave? Did they try laying them out nicely, or was it all higgledy-piggledy? And I think from this image here, you can see there's no pattern whatsoever. These individuals were tossed in. And as a matter of fact, we think they were probably tossed in the same way that you would think of tossing, a heavy mattress or something, sort of one person on the hand end, one person on the leg end, and sort of hup, hup, ho, alley-oop, chucking bodies into the grave. They really are essentially falling into the grave and then being shoved aside to make room for more bodies, which is a fairly incredible treatment for human remains, given that just, a couple meters away, we have these extraordinary elaborate human sacrifices. So there are some articulated bodies, and we did try and collect data on those as well. Obviously, one of the solutions we used was to, again, use a sort of spatial mapping so that we could take points on every little articulation. So where the knee bone, where the thigh bone meets the tibia and fibula, we would take a little point so that we can later map these individuals back in after we've collected them, because it is very difficult to reconstruct a grave like this post hoc. It's something we're still working on. But we have been able to do a little bit with these digital models. So this is, for instance, a distribution of ages. And one of the things you might notice is the ages here go from about 5 to 25. So we have very young individuals in this grave. There are slightly older individuals, possibly sort of slightly, later than 25, possibly. But in the articulated individuals, we're really not finding good evidence of people who are older. And that is very suspicious, because despite what you might think about the risk of teenagers dying, they don't actually die that often. So this is a very particular age group who are going into this death pit. We also used photogrammetry. We're not quite sure to what effect yet, because we have not finished the reconstruction. By we, I mean me, that's on me. But you saw the earlier picture where I was sitting down taking photos. And what I was actually doing is taking these overlapping photos of the grave, which we did periodically as we excavated, in order to capture a sort of 3D elevation model as we went through, where we could actually identify in a full 3D the various remains as they were being exposed. So all of this is there to help us reconstruct the deposition event that led to this mass death pit. And essentially what we have is, a mess. We have an immense number of very young individuals who were thrown into a pit very rapidly. By looking at their positioning, we can see that they were probably still relatively floppy. They were not in rigor mortis, so it was probably soon after death, or possibly quite some time, a considerable time after death. But since we find even the little ear bones and the little feet and toes, we think that they were put into this pit quite soon after death, still with soft tissue on, and very aggressively kind of put into a space that was hastily cut, possibly lined with something like river clay to sort of keep out smell, but otherwise with absolutely no thought towards burial position or display of the bodies or burial ritual. And then comes the next part, which is, of course, the bioarchaeology. These are the crates of human remains excavated from just that one context. We have been going through our lab at Ege University and slowly piecing together some of the bits of the puzzle and some of the people who are the puzzle. So we have a rough minimum number of individuals, or MNI, of about 63. And they are ages between 5 and possibly as late as 35, though that might be younger. And there are either very few or no females. And again, coming back to our fancy tooth technique for guessing whether things are male or female, we have so many young people at Başur Höyük that it's possible that everyone looks a little bit girlish. People haven't come into their full sort of growth. And so our sort of algorithm for guessing who's male and female might be slightly skewed towards female. Luckily, we are working with the DNA team from the Natural History Museum of London, so we should get some clarity on this. But as some of you will know very well, bioarchaeology is something of a dark art, and we can only say what we know, and we have to admit when we are not entirely sure. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. But anyhow, so we have young and very few, possibly no females, and we have a lot. And this is true actually of the whole cemetery. So this little graph is the dead people in the entire cemetery. And you may remember as we were going through the graves, we had these inner-walled cysts that all had sort of teenage boys in them. And then we had a sort of mix of adults and children outside. There is essentially something that you expect in a cemetery. If you're getting all the people who die in a cemetery, what you end up with is a little graph of lots of very young people and lots of very old people, because that's who dies. What you don't expect is what we have at Başur, which is a far greater number of young people, particularly sort of teenage, than you would possibly expect. So what we can definitely say is that unless teenager life was incredibly dangerous and nobody ever lived to be elderly and nobody ever died as a child, we are only seeing part of the picture at Başur Höyük, that the people who are doing the burying at Başur Höyük are deliberately choosing a subsection of the population for burial in this cemetery. And we have started on some of the biomolecular analysis. So this is from Suzanne Pilar Birch at the University of Georgia, Athens, and she's been doing work on the isotopic signature. So apologies for the small chart, but essentially you have isotopes that reveal the chemical signature when various bone and teeth tissues were forming. So this is looking at strontium ratios. So strontium is something that's in the geology. Your teeth and your bones pick it up. Your teeth grow in childhood and then carry the childhood signal, whereas your bone carries a much more recent signal from the last couple of years. So your teeth and bone will have a signal of where you grew up and where you ended up. And what we can see is teeth, these little orange dots, are almost all outside of the local geology. So people did not grow up on the Höyük and end up buried there, except for possibly about 2 people in the mass death pit. A couple of the individuals seem to have spent their last years on the Höyük. Almost all of the people in the mass death pit seem to have lived in the area before dying, but very few of the people who are in inside those retainer graves appear to have a local signature. It's hard to know where their signature is from because, of course, there's a lot of geology out there, but it might be from somewhere closer towards Batman and off that direction, but we don't know yet. So further work, I believe, is coming. But it's very notable that we have a mix of local and non-local individuals who are moving throughout their lives at Başur. And one of the things that we were able to do at Başur, which I'm incredibly grateful for, which was BIAA supported, was try and bring some of this anthropological archaeology back into the department at EGE. So we tried a slightly interesting experiment, which was asking the students, some of whom had been on the excavation, some of whom had just worked with me in the lab, to present to their peers and supervisors what they had learned in terms of excavating to make your anthropologist happy, in order to essentially sort of how best practice and integrating anthropological practice. And this actually was incredibly successful, and hopefully we'll get to run it again. But we have Osnar and who talked to us about excavation techniques. Pinar talked to us about cleaning and processing and sampling for DNA and isotopes. And Mohammed actually took on the job of explaining some of the basic things we can learn from the skeleton, including things like the sex from the pelvis and the skull. And it was just a really wonderful workshop. And I'd just like to thank everyone involved for letting us be a little bit experimental and carrying the knowledge forward. So what is Başur doing? I've taken you on a rapid fire tour of what is possibly one of the most interesting funerary contexts that I've ever seen. And we have a lot of questions. And the question is really, what does Başur mean? What is this early Bronze Age cemetery doing? What does it mean in terms of changes in the region? One of the things that has been talked about a lot is, of course, very interesting at Başur, because we have so much metal, is the role of metal in sacrifice, and the idea that metal can be something that you can sort of use to display wealth and power. And one of the questions, that we have to ask is, are we taking this idea of the sort of wealth and power displayed by taking your vast riches in metal and dumping them in a hole and saying, I don't even need them? Are we doing this essentially with human lives? And if so, what kind of society is that? And what does it tell us about how human beings were organizing themselves? And just to point out, at Başur, we have an absolutely immense amount of metal. It's not directly comparable, but we have 100 plus spearheads in that big retainer grave, whereas at Arslan Tepe, which is the nearest comparative site, they have far fewer, I believe. And we really do have a lot of metal objects. So the stars are over these walled inner cysts. So you can see that by the time we get to grave 13 and grave 15, we just have an immense number of metal objects, but there's metal throughout the site. And the thing that we kind of want to talk about is how this reflects the social organization that's sort of putting these people in the ground. And this is a little quote from Eddie Peltenberg, but it's just to sort of remind me to talk about corporate versus exclusionary power, and the idea that human beings can either organize themselves in a way that when they get together, they make a big effort to only do group things where there's no obvious status differences, or when they get together, they make a big effort to show that there are status differences, and that this is possibly this exclusionary trend is kind of what we're seeing in the burial tradition that's starting up in the transition 4th and 3rd millennium and crawling down the Euphrates and Tigris rivers down towards Mesopotamia. And what I'd like to sort of look at is sort of how the bodies at Başur are sending us this message, and different techniques we have for kind of examining this. And mostly what I want to talk about is the idea of the message being part of display, that burial is, of course, an act done by the living community for a reason. And we have two kind of depositional events that I sort of split things up into. We have an act of killing. So that's the actual deaths in terms of our sacrifice burials. And then we have the burial and commemoration. So these are two different events that we should be able somehow to find traces of in the archaeological record. And what we want to understand is, when we see these events, who are they for? Who is the audience? And where did they happen? Because where they happened, of course, tells us who was able to see them. So audience is either going to be everyone in these large corporate rituals. So I'm thinking of sort of Göbekli Tepe, which was the image I showed on the previous slide. Something like, where you might have lots and lots of visible things, or you might have rituals that are a little bit hidden. And then exclusive rituals where you only have a limited audience, where only some people are privy to the cult secrets or the process that's happening. And of course, location, where you find these things, where you find evidence of these events, is going to be the key factor in telling us what the audience is. So sort of think about this in three different scales. One is sort of the scale of the individual. Second is a sort of site-specific scale. So the site, for instance, is something happening in a broad public area on a site, or is it happening behind several closed doors in the interior of a temple? And of course, the larger landscape is something happening in a prominent place in the landscape that's accessible by many different passerby, or is it something that's happening in a very limited, only, sort of one site, single site access context? And you don't have to look at this too long, I promise, but these are just in my mind. The way that we understand this is by looking at audience and location for both these active killing and burial commemoration at these different scales, in order to understand something of the message that is being transmitted by lethal violence, by human sacrifice. So let's go to the first one, the act of killing at Başur Höyük. And this is the difficult one, because this is very, very hard to piece together. What we do know from the retainer burials is that death was extremely violent. Head wounds in young people are kind of horrific. That's not a very nice way to die. So we have to wonder, how are those wounds inflicted? Where are they inflicted? And who is the audience that is seeing them inflicted? And in the case, of course, the mass death pit, we have not yet uncovered any pathological trauma, which makes it even more of a mystery. So with the act of killing, we want to ask, are these, it could be sacrifice, it could be executions, it could be that our 8 dead people outside of grade 15 died in conflict, died in fighting somewhere else, and were transported back into this grave. And that's a kind of individual scale visibility. Whether this act of killing happened in a closed or open ritual, who saw it would be sort of site specific, and then where it happened in the landscape again. And these are questions we really don't have great answers for, because it is very difficult to identify where the deaths actually took place. The problem with lethal violence, and here's Wound Man, everyone's favorite medieval European medical text, is that violence is very difficult to see. There's a soft tissue bias. You do not aim a stab wound at a bone, you aim it at soft tissue, and it is only through luck, sort of, selectively interpreted, that bioarchaeologists like myself are able to find the cut marks or nicks that tell us that someone has been a victim of sharp force trauma. Preservation is another issue. We saw that the preservation in the mass death pit was not terrific. So what we have is essentially a problem with the act of killing, is that we don't have any sacrificial altars like the Aztec. We don't have gallows or commemorative battle stela to tell us what happened here. We have much better luck with burial and commemoration, and particularly in the case of the cis, we can actually start looking at status and distinction, which I think are coming through and being communicated very clearly through these exclusive rituals. So on the individual scale, we can probably say that this is aimed at people in the know, because these burials are wearing essentially, these special bichrome panels that must have a meaning, which means that their audience must understand the meaning because they're repeated in specific contexts. They have ritual objects, which I'm not quite sure of the bird woman cup meaning, but I'm fairly sure that someone in the early Bronze Age did know what that meant. So there are these, there's a panel, and of course the massive deposition of weaponry, and weaponry in graves of people who were possibly too young to actually use them, including, 12-year-old kids. Whether they would have been mighty warriors who needed 100 bundle spears is a question entirely. So we can say that we're already communicating specific status and distinctions between people at the individual scale. When we come to the site-specific scale at Başur Höyük, we suspect that there's probably a restricted audience for some of these rituals. The graves are not hugely visible after the actual burial. They're sort of subterranean excavated. They sit quite low. How many people can see a hole in the ground? These might actually be quite restricted audiences. And then when we come to the landscape scale, it actually might be, this is where our wider audience is. This is where our wider message is supposed to be communicated. Because you can think of things like the retainer burials at Abydos, which are presaged by huge processions that travel through the landscape. And it's worth thinking about Başur Höyük as this early Bronze Age cemetery as kind of the end product of a display that's situated in a landscape that's much larger than just the site itself. So, seeing violence at Başur Höyük, without knowing where death happened and who saw it, it's very difficult to understand the actual message that's sort of being sent by killing people. And we do assume that they were trying to send a message, because it's quite an intense thing to do. And with the mass death pit, of course, we have the problem, we don't actually know exactly what killed them. And we have a considerable, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, which is the bane of an archaeologist's life. But there you go, it's true. We don't know how they died. We are still working at it. And when things are a little bit more normal, I'll be returning to the lab. But we do know that they're young. They are from a slightly different geographic region, more local than the big cis burials. There might not be any women. And there are no answers yet. So luckily, we have work coming through from our DNA team, Ian and Selena, and there will be more work in the lab coming up as circumstances permit. But essentially, we have quite a lot of questions, and I have quite a lot of people to thank. So thank you, everyone, for listening. And I just want to make sure that I mention the vast number of human beings who have put immense amount of work into this project, and the HRC funded project that's following on, which is myself and David Wengrow at UCL, the Radical Death Project. But thank you to everyone who has helped. And yeah, I think if anyone has made it through that, we can take some questions.
Thank you, Brenna. Thank you very much for that. It's a fascinating site. I didn't realize how much you'd managed to excavate and find out so far. I've got lots of questions, but I will go to the Q&A questions that we've already got in from our audience, and I'll ask my questions a little bit later if we get a lull. Please do submit your questions through the Q&A box if you have any. I'll start at the top. We have the first question was from Phyllis Erdogan, who asks what MD and DL mean under the pictures of the teeth.
That is a perfectly good question. So apologies for the tooth terminology. Those are mesiodistal and distolingual. So when anthropologists talk about teeth, they talk about the different sides. They are essentially, mesiodistal is side to side, distolingual is front to back. So there are two different dimensions that we measure that big canine tooth in order to come up with a kind of measurement that we can use to say how big the tooth is relative to another tooth.
Okay, a bit of jargon. Thank you for that.
Drown everyone in jargon.
We all have our own jargon. Don't worry. Susan Sherratt asks a question of whether there are any traces of textiles that bound the spearheads in grade 15. Since often proximity bronze can often create an impression of textiles.
Yes. So actually textile preservation is, well, considering that lots of my work is on PPN, amazing. So there are very nice chunks of textile that do survive. I believe there may be a postdoctoral researcher who is going to start looking at them, though the team can probably chip in on that. I believe that, so there, I think you saw the spearhead image. So those textiles were preserved. Some of the textiles that were wrapping the actual spear, and I believe they are preserved at Batman Museum and have been conserved there. I think they will be researched in future, but there are quite interesting things going on with the textiles, I believe, that I am not qualified to speak on.
Thank you for that. Before we move on from the spearheads, can I just ask a question about the spearheads? Do you know whether they were used, whether there was any use wear on any of these spears, or whether the metal objects, and we get the picture that there's a lot of metal on this in these burials, were they used artifacts or were they curated specially for burial, do you think?
Well, I think I am not qualified specifically to answer, but I will tell you what I think I have heard, which is essentially that the preservation is not always amazing of the bronze. There has been some water action. And I believe Martina Massimino, who was at Durham, was looking at some of this. And the medals are currently with Batman Museum. And I think they are in the process of being conserved in order to examine questions like that. I mean, I think my impression is that when you have 13 tied up in a bundle, and then another 13, and then another, when you've just got bunches of them, that they are not used, but they may be, in which case it'd be a very interesting contribution to our interpretation of the events leading up to the burial.
I think either way, it'll be interesting, whether they're used or whether they're made specially for the burial. They'll tell very different stories. Thank you. Our next question comes from Eleni Milka from Greece. Hello, Eleni. She was wondering whether how you managed to define the limits of the multi-burial pit, and if you water sieved the soil of the burials.
So there is a fairly distinct fine clay layer that appears to have been essentially, they've dug a pit into earlier Uruk period sort of room fill. So we can see the cut very nicely, and then they filled it with a very fine thin layer of a sort of whitish, almost yellowy green. It's a funny color. Clay that looks like it's probably like proper river clay, like really nice fine stuff, and that makes a pretty obvious barrier. So we can see the outline of the cut. The soil, we have soil samples from both just the general soil amidst the bones, and from this actual river clay sort of layer. We have not water sieved them yet. It is still in the lab, actually, but Yes, no, I think very hopeful that actually there's quite a bit left to do with some of the sort of non-skeletal samples that we were able to take out of the burial.
We have another spear question from Jehun Eminli. Is the spear an indicator of sex?
We don't know. I think with the spears, we just don't know what they mean. If if they are people's personal battle weapons, we might stereotypically expect them to be associated with males. However, if they're sort of how you bank, if instead of having coins, you've got some lovely metal spearheads that you're sort of using as wealth, it'd be a very different picture. So we're not really able to use the grave goods to narrow down that kind of gender role so easily. But of course, it'd be very interesting to find out, if they're always associated with men and never with women or something like that. So far, I don't think we've seen that, but there's men and women are mixed in the same grave, so it's very hard to know.
Maybe this is an opportune moment for me to ask one of my questions, and it's generally about how we in archaeology sex skeletons, and you referred to the dark art of sexing human remains. And as far as I'm aware, unless a female has given birth, that is the absolute indicator that the skeleton is a female. Otherwise, we rely on the type of skeleton form, whether it's a robust skeleton or a gracile skeleton, to sex this assemblage. As we're now learning more about gender attribution today in our current life, do you think that we will have to revisit how we sex skeletons in terms of people with female sexing and male sexing rather than a gender attribution?
Yeah, well, I mean, I hope that most practicing bioarchaeologists, if you ask them, is it a male or female, they'll say, well, it's probably biologically male or biologically female. And I think we're all aware of, that biological sex can indicate kind of what gender role you played in life, but may not have anything to do with it. And one of the difficulties in terms of using the biological indicators is that, yes, probably finding the remains of a fetus inside a female skeleton would be the absolute evidence. But the other thing we have now is DNA. And this offers some certainty in a very uncertain world. And I've caveated my guesses of boy or girl quite heavily just for exactly these reasons. We also have to remember that populations look very different. So I will always remember my experiences learning in England, and Romans and Anglo-Saxons, man. You thought you knew what female looked like, and then it didn't work out. But populations are very different around the world through time, and depending on whether they're healthy or not, whether they grew big or did not. So there's a vast amount of variation in the human skeleton. And yes, don't trust anyone who tells you they know exactly what's going on unless they've got a DNA result.
Look forward to more DNA results. Thank you. Susan Shallis asks, could the mass burial have been due to an epidemic? I think you said there was no evidence of violence in that grave.
Yes, so that is correct. So I know epidemics are probably on everyone's mind, but that is something that we are actively considering. So not only have we taken considerable amounts of DNA samples, which will hopefully be able to tell us if there are certain types of bacteria present inside the bones, i.e., active in the people, but also soil samples from relevant sort of stomach areas, things like that. So there are a couple kinds of disease that it is possible to identify from sort of dirt DNA or from DNA sort of analysis. One of those, for instance, is plague, Black Death, Yersinia pestis. So that is identifiable through DNA, and it's not unlikely that something on the road to the rest of Asia, wouldn't be where something like Black Death came into the world. And we now know from DNA typing of plague bacteria that it probably did come out of Asia and into Eurasia a couple times before, the one in medieval Europe that we think of. So the other problem is some epidemic diseases leave no trace. If it doesn't affect the skeleton and it doesn't leave behind DNA, we can't see it. So we have to consider whether there are diseases that affect certain age groups that would leave this very weird age profile, 5 to 35, or whether we are just missing evidence for violence, or the use of poison, which was suggested for the Royal Cemetery at Ur, or something completely different.
Lots of questions.
Yes.
Phyllis Erdogan asks if you can explain what a cyst is.
Yes, sorry. So cyst, a little bit of archaeology terminology there. It is just the word that we use for that grave that has the stone sides. So it just means any sort of grave that's essentially like a built container. So a stone cyst is made of stone. A ceramic cyst would be made of ceramic. It's just that word for the container that's holding the burial.
Thank you. Jeffrey Summers from Mauritius thanks you for a great talk. And he asks whether the spearheads were attached to shafts or were there only the metal heads?
Very good question. I will actually defer entirely to the team if they ever want to answer that, maybe in the chat. But I think there is some possibility that some of them did have shafts still attached. I don't know if we know entirely, but I believe there was some thought that it at least certainly was possible that there were shafts attached. And I think someone had suggested perhaps the shafts were deposited separately, that, you sort of just had the pieces of the spears, but I don't know if that was just my fevered imagination or not. I'll let the team answer that.
Then make your own kit. An anonymous attendee asks whether there are any conservators on the site.
Yeah. So Batman Museum has a conservation program and was, sort of the partner on the excavation. So all of the various materials and things have gone off with the conservators who were employed at Batman Museum. So they were on site and able to take things to the museum fairly rapidly, I think.
Bashak Boz, hi Bashak.
Hi Bashak.
Says thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, the work that you're doing. She wants to know, she asks about the depth of the death with the 63 individuals.
Mid-thigh if you were standing. It's a 1.25, something like that. It's really shallow. It sort of gives the impression of being something that was excavated very shallow. They didn't quite realize how many people they were going to have to fit into this space. And then they were actually dumped a bunch of people in, and then they started pushing the top levels off to the side in order to fit more bodies in.
Wow, that creates an interesting visual event, doesn't it? Gosh. Ruler Shafiq asks, whether you can elaborate on the sex method using canines? What would be the cutoff point between males and females?
So again, it's a little bit like the issue with the Romans and the Anglo-Saxons, is that every population, every like local group is going to have a slightly different level of difference. So some people will have really big male canines and really small female ones. Some people will have less obvious differences. So what you have to do is essentially you take your adult skeletons, the males and females, who you're pretty sure because of the skeletal shape and size are males and females, and you measure their canines. And then you plot those out and try to make two groups out of them. So you sort of inform the algorithm. I do have a paper about this from some time ago out there in the world. I think it's on ResearchGate. But essentially, you create a population-specific cutoff point, because you can't really use something that works in Bronze Age Anatolia with something that works in post-medieval London, because they're just, the people are slightly different looking.
Thank you. Lisa Kielhofer asks, well, what other regional evidence there is for similar practices during the EBA?
This is an excellent question. There is essentially a long tail of individual cyst burials that kicks off and sort of starts filtering down, particularly the Euphrates. So in the early Bronze Age, we start to get, so in the Uruk period, we don't really know where people are buried. We don't have big cemeteries. We don't have evidence for dead people, really. They have, it's sort of not obvious what's going on with the burial ritual. Suddenly, the early Bronze Age, after the Uruk cultural material kind of starts disappearing in various places, we get individual cyst burials. And some of those have grave goods. Some of them have not very impressive grave goods. With little, minuscule amounts of metal, and some of them have an immense amount of metal. And then, of course, the closest comparator is Arslan Tepe, which has quite a lot of metal, very similar stylistically. I think Tepe Gara has similar metal. There's a lot of cultural similarity in the metal to different things. There's a lot of cultural similarity in the cyst graves to different sites. So it's a slightly syncretic, slightly odd phenomenon that I'd be lying if I said I completely understood. But essentially, you'd sort of say that in terms of human sacrifice, what you get with these big cyst graves, with the metal deposit, with the deposit of human lives, you see Arslan Tepe at Başur Höyük at almost exactly the same time. And then 500 years later and 500 kilometers south, you see the ridiculousness that is the Royal Cemetery at Ur, which is just hundreds of retainer burials.
Thank you very much for that. Eleni Milka asks, how many skeletons or skulls were there with injuries, signs of injury?
So the actual pathological sharp force trauma, we only have two skeletons from outside of the big retainer grave. That is the limit of what we absolutely have evidence for. There are minor pathologies, but nothing that looks lethal anywhere else yet. We have a very large mass death pit that we need to go through very carefully.
It sounds as if it's going to be your life's work, Brenna.
No. 3 years left on the grant.
Riza Tunchel asks whether you can say anything about Başur and the death, any parallels between Başur and the death pit at Tel Brak, where likewise there were comparable majority of young, very...
Yeah, so Tel Brak is really interesting. So Tel Brak, I think, if I remember the most current interpretation, is that there's the very big death pit is essentially secondary. burial. So these are remains that were possibly actually exposed and then reburied in a kind of midden. This is the sort of Tel Majnouna death pit, reburied in an almost sort of midden context. So that would be burials that were not in immediate deposition. Telbrac is a really interesting comparator because, of course, they're very built up, and they seem to have some sort of destruction layers and things going on. But as far as I remember, Brac has essentially a lot more secondary burial. That they're not. It's not people straight into the ground in the same way that we have at Başur.
Interesting. Patty Watermaker asks whether you know anything about the spatial relationship between the graves and the contemporary housing.
I wish I knew. So there is some evidence of what is possibly a settlement at the same time, which is not entirely common for these mounds that have these early Bronze Age cis graves. Not all of them have settlements. Most of them sort of had an Uruk presence, then they have nothing. They just have cis graves that sort of show up. But we do have some domestic ceramics, I believe. I will let the team, if they want to chime in on the chat, answer if they'd like. But it is essentially on a different part of the mound. The mound at some point was kind of two mounds. There was a little bit of a gap. There was a dip in between the north part of the mound and the south part of the mound. So they would have been all situated behind Uruk period fortification walls, and God knows how high those were still standing, at least in the south part. Where the settlement was, or what it was in terms of character, we just don't know. And this was a rescue excavation, so these are the circumstances that we have to live with.
Questions are coming in thick and fast for you, Brenna, and we'll keep going until we've got another 10 minutes or so. We'll keep going until about 6:30, and apologies to everyone whose questions we don't get to.
Well, you're welcome to find me on Twitter afterwards and ask me. I'm at Brenna Walks. So if you do want to ask your question and I haven't got to it, I'll try and get there. Thanks
very much for that offer, Brenna. Liz Garusha, thanks you very much for a great lecture. Whoops, where's her question gone? How could we know whether death occurred if we don't have any but the bones? What is the forensic context? What's the context of the death as opposed to the burial?
So this is the English is completely comprehensible. It's the subject that is at fault. It's a complicated issue. So it's something that I've been thinking about recently in terms of kind of the larger phenomenon of state-sanctioned killing, so judicial killings and human sacrifice, things where the society has gotten together and said it's okay to kill this person. And the thing that I think is really key in terms of location is identifying purpose-built structures, identifying deposits of purpose-built instruments for so things like gallows. So there are contexts elsewhere in the world where you could say this is an execution platform, this is a temple where we know that sacrifice was carried out on this altar, and this is where the libations go down. So we can really identify the libation or the location. Things that were, instruments of killing, if we found those deposited, that might be helpful. But I think in the vast majority of contexts, except for very, very recent ones, or things that happen in Siberia, so we actually do get decent preservation, we just don't know. It's very difficult to reconstruct. And I think that might be hindering us in understanding what this sudden invention of human sacrifice means.
Thank you. Our next question is from Thomas Zimmerman. Again, thank you for a fascinating lecture. a comment rather than a question initially. The chemical composition of the metal objects, specifically the spearheads, is presumably similar to those of Aslan Tepe, that is arsenic, copper, and high in nickel. Are there also some copper-silver alloys observed at Başur Höyük?
I think there is. So I do not know the metal well. Metin, where are you? In the chat, you can answer. So yes, they are copper alloys. They're not. Nothing is true bronze at this point. I think they are very, very similar to the composition at Arslan Tepe. And as presented at the Malatya Symposium at Arslan Tepe, whatever it was, 2 years ago, I believe Metin showed a slide that did have some copper silver alloy, but I could be imagining that at this point. but yeah, I think Metin will be able to answer your question, or if you find me on the various social medias, I can direct you to Metin to ask more directly.
Great, thank you. Lots of questions for Metin.
That's always the case. That's Metin's role here.
Yuka Iwa asks, how was the site closed before the dam development started up again?
So I wasn't actually present for that season, but I believe essentially it's just been backfilled and secured, because the dam construction has gone ahead and the water is out there.
Right. Gordon Higgs asks whether there was a contemporary power center nearby. Could the sacrifices have been hostages from other communities, or might the preponderance of young males suggest the elimination of competitor male lines? Interesting.
So yeah, so that's a very interesting question. We've certainly considered that. If they're all males and they're all sort of, you can certainly imagine a situation in which you have a sort of consolidation of power, and you have lineage-based power groups, and one lineage gets to sort of have hostages or not, that they could sort of do away with if they wanted to. So we don't know a lot about what power looked like at this point, and that's kind of what we're trying to access through looking at these burials, through looking at whatever bits of material culture we can find. So it's actually, the question is, what would a power center look like? Would it be a center? Are these coalescing nomadic groups that are occupying this landscape in various different ways, seasonally, annually? Are they sedentary farmers like their brethren down south in Mesopotamia proper? Who is where? What are they doing? How are they living? These are the big questions that we're just starting to sort of scratch at.
Dalia Albagina asks, well, thanks you for a great lecture. Lots of thanks from appreciative audience, always what you want to hear. Amazing site and amazing research. Her question is about isotopic results. Is there a general trend, have you noticed, with carbon and nitrogen?
So this, I do not have the data on myself. I will direct you to Suzanne Pilar Birch. And you can either find me through Twitter or email, and I can direct you to her. But I believe she is starting to present some of her results on that, and we are all anxiously waiting.
We have our next question from Director of the BIAA, Lutgard van de Poot. Hi, Lut. Thank you for a great lecture. She says, I had the impression that the remains in and outside the burial chamber had similar amounts of grave goods, and they also seem to be of similar types. If the people on the outside were ritually killed as companions or servants, for instance, how are the grave goods explained?
This is, of course, a very interesting question, and it goes to our question of kind of what those burials mean. So a lot of the ceramics that are in the sort of external grave, and Metin will correct me if I'm wrong, may actually be part of essentially the funerary rituals. So they may not be gifts for the people that they're next to. They may be part of the ritual that those people are part of. So they might be, I think we do find some animal remains and things, burnt bones. So they might be part of the funerary ritual, just as the sacrificed bodies are part of the funerary ritual, and just happen to be located outside rather than inside. And it might be that certain types of artifact are common to everyone. So everyone gets little bronze pins to close their cloaks because it's like buttons. Everyone has to have buttons on their clothes.
The next question from Douglas Baird. Hello, Doug. It's nice to see you here. Similarly, he asks whether there's any differentiation between the health of the principal occupants and of the cysts and subsidiary burials.
So this is a very good question. Currently, I would say that there's nothing obvious. Everyone actually seems to be quite healthy. There's really no evidence for massive amounts of what I sort of look at in my very specialized world, which is lines on teeth, sort of evidence of childhood ill health, with which a lot of people would associate with lower status. And there's really not a lot of it in any of these burials. They appear to be reasonably healthy. I wouldn't rule it totally out because I haven't managed to completely sign off all of my pathological assessments in the lab. But from what I can see, that there's not a huge amount of difference.
Thank you. Bashak has a follow-on question, as does Susan Sherratt, but I'll just take a couple of new questions and then maybe we can come back to those two if we have time. So Kate Clow asks about the age, whether there was whether you could tell the old, very young, and possibly poor, whether there was any differentiation of where they were buried.
And there's Inan popping up at the bottom to tell us. Okay, Inan is also able to answer these questions. Thank you, Inan. So to Kate's question, so we don't know where the rest of the people are. There's certainly not enough people to support a settlement. You couldn't have a world that was just made of teenagers, as much as they would like that. So we don't know what the default burial tradition would have been. One of the suggestions over time has been that in sort of more less sedentary, more mobile cultures, that you might have different traditions of burial depending on where you are in the year, in your sort of cycle around the world. And of course, it might be that people from different status would have very different burial traditions. It might be that, there are cremations all up and down the valley that are very small, very difficult to see archaeologically, that are exactly from this period, but we just haven't found them because they're not sitting on a big giant mound that is incredibly obvious because it's 7,000 years of human habitation. So we have a missing burial problem pretty much throughout human history, actually. So.
There are some responses from team members in the chat to previous questions, so I'll jump to Nikki Papakonstantino's question, which is a possible scenario for the mass pit burial. The presence of both articulated and disarticulated bones implies that you could have several depositional episodes. What is the picture of the bone representation on the remains? Right.
Yes. So that's probably me being slightly unclear. So all of the remains in the grave were deposited as fully articulated burials. So it's not, despite the fact that we had to pick up pieces as though we were collecting secondary depositional burials, they were actually all buried as single inhumations. What's happened is, because of the stacking, there's sort of 3-ish bodies deep, is that as the soft tissue collapsed, various elements sank through, fell, disarticulated in different amounts. There was obviously open space within the grave. Well, not open, but looser soil that allowed some bones to move out of context. So this seems very clearly to actually be, it was a single opening depositional event with just single inhumations. And the problem is that after the top layer, it gets very difficult to see which remains are articulated with which because of this in-grave soil movement. Hence the use of the gridded collection. So actually the representation is exactly what you would hope for and expect in terms of having everyone there. So we have a lot of little fingers and toes, a lot. But we do have essentially enough to make up these sort of 60 odd people. The only sort of lack of representation we have is in bones that are easily destroyed, so ribs and other kind of friable bones that don't survive vertebra don't always do so well either.
Well, I think looking at the time that we should end on that question. You were able to answer that one definitively, and good that we can leave on a high.
I'll just tell Başak, I think they shoved them in. I think that's how they fit them all.
Apologies for questions we couldn't get round to, but as Brenna offered, she can be reached on Brenna Walks, is that Brenna?
Yeah, Twitter is at Brenna Walks, or you can Google my name, I think it comes up. So
before I give my thanks to our great guest speaker this evening, I'd like to thank Laura Patterson and Charlotte Jordan for setting up the Zoom lecture. Thank you for your support throughout this lecture, and I'd like to thank all of our attendees, all of our guests who have come together this evening to listen to Brenna's fascinating talk. And if you've enjoyed this evening's lecture, please join more. Please look to joining the BIAA as a member. It's our membership group that keeps us able to continue in the great work that we do. Brenna, that was a fantastic talk. You took us through some very difficult subject topic, particularly now when we're all thinking about death and mass burials as well. In the future, how are people going to interpret some of these mass burials that we're finding happening today all around the world? So fascinating, so many more questions, and we really look forward to finding out more, and hope that sometime when you're getting towards the end of your research, that you can come back and give us another update. So I'm sure everyone out there is raising their hands, raising their glasses to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been very fun to present my little bit on what is obviously a very big team effort. And I think, yeah, real appreciation for the team who makes my dead people actually mean something. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming, everyone. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you.